Welcome to Fragile Bonds, to the powerful stories of family, love, loss, and the choices that shape our lives. Now let's begin today's story.
On an autumn afternoon, soft sunlight streamed through the windows of the living room in a house located in a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. Allison Harrison sat on the sofa, nursing her 3-month-old son Oliver. She felt happy as his tiny hand gripped her finger. In the corner of the living room, Oliver's older brother Ethan was building something with blocks. Now in 2nd grade, Ethan had grown into a kind and caring child. Occasionally, he would turn to look at his mother as if checking on his baby brother, and after confirming that Oliver was contentedly feeding, he would return to his play. Allison was on maternity leave, currently devoted to childcare. She had previously worked as a busy event planner, but after Oliver was born, she chose to prioritize time with her family. Her husband David had been especially busy with work lately, often leaving early in the morning on weekdays and returning late at night. Still, he made time for family on weekends, playing with Ethan at the park and helping Allison with household chores. The doorbell rang. Allison looked at the clock. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was exactly the time she had expected. Ethan rushed to the front door and opened it. Patricia Harrison's cheerful voice could be heard. Her mother-in-law Patricia lived about 15 minutes away by car and visited frequently to see her grandchildren. When Patricia entered the living room, she first smiled at Allison. In her hands, as always, was a container filled with homemade cookies. When Allison expressed her gratitude, Patricia smiled gently and replied that it was only natural since they were family. As she spoke, she picked up Oliver, who had just finished nursing, and kissed his cheek affectionately. The baby smiled contentedly in his grandmother's arms. Allison was genuinely grateful to her mother-in-law. Patricia was truly good to her. She cooked meals, helped with laundry, and was happy to care for Oliver. Especially for Allison, who was exhausted from caring for a newborn, her mother-in-law's help was truly appreciated. Their relationship was good, and there seemed to be no particular problems. That afternoon, Patricia began preparing dinner in the kitchen. Allison was encouraged to rest a little and was settling Oliver down for a nap in the living room. Ethan was presumably doing homework in his room. However, what Allison didn't notice was that Ethan had gradually begun retreating to his room each time his grandmother visited. Before, he would run up to her happily when she arrived, but recently he would just greet her and immediately go upstairs. Allison thought her son was growing up and becoming shy. David said it might be the beginning of adolescence. Neither of them thought it was particularly serious. That Sunday evening, after Patricia finished preparing dinner, she told Allison to relax and rest. She would take care of everything today. Allison expressed her thanks and accepted her mother-in-law's kindness. Oliver was smiling happily in his crib. Ethan was playing in his room. Patricia was humming cheerfully in the kitchen while cooking. In the living room, Allison was enjoying a leisurely cup of coffee for the first time in a while. Everything was calm, a peaceful Sunday afternoon. 3 months had passed since Oliver was born, and Patricia's visits had become even more frequent. About 3 times a week, sometimes appearing unannounced. Every time the doorbell rang, Allison knew it was her mother-in-law. Patricia always had a smile on her face and something in her hands, a gift of some kind. Sometimes homemade pie, sometimes new clothes for the baby, sometimes Ethan's favorite cookies. One Thursday morning, Patricia visited as usual. Allison was in the middle of changing Oliver's diaper. Her mother-in-law entered the house as if it were her own, immediately putting on an apron and heading to the kitchen. While saying that caring for a baby must be difficult, she checked the contents of the refrigerator and began preparing lunch. Allison was grateful. She really was. Without Patricia's help, caring for a newborn would have been much harder. But at the same time, she was beginning to feel a small sense of suffocation. A feeling that even though it was her own home, her mother-in-law was taking control. But thinking it would be ungrateful to say such things, Allison didn't say anything. Rather, she blamed herself for feeling that way. Patricia was the perfect mother-in-law. She cooked, cleaned, helped with laundry, and soothed the baby. David was proud of his mother too. Allison's own mother lived on the opposite side of the East Coast and couldn't visit frequently. That's why Patricia's presence was precious. However, Ethan's behavior was becoming stranger day by day. It became noticeable one Saturday afternoon. When Patricia visited, Ethan stood up from the living room and went upstairs without saying anything. His grandmother looked a little sad and called out to Ethan, asking if he wanted to play with Grandma. Ethan stopped midway up the stairs and answered without turning around that he had homework. His voice was small and seemed somehow tense. Patricia's shoulders drooped. She said she was lonely, her voice truly filled with sadness. Allison called Ethan back and gently scolded him, saying it was rude to Grandma. Ethan apologized quietly, but his expression was dark and he wouldn't make eye contact. He disappeared into his room just like that. Allison didn't understand why. Ethan used to love Patricia. When his grandmother came, he would happily hug her, play games with her, and bake treats together. But at some point, he began avoiding his mother-in-law. When she consulted David, her husband said it was probably the beginning of adolescence. Even at 7, such changes can occur. Allison decided to think so too. There was no other explanation. A few days later, Allison made an opportunity to be alone with Ethan. Oliver was napping and David was away at work. Ethan was playing with Lego blocks in his room. Allison sat down next to her son and carefully broached the subject. She asked if he disliked Grandma. Ethan stopped what he was doing and shook his head. No, he answered quietly. Then why do you avoid her? She continued. Ethan looked troubled, fidgeting with the blocks as he answered that he didn't know. Allison placed her hand on her son's shoulder. She said that if something unpleasant had happened, she wanted him to tell her. But Ethan said nothing. However, in his eyes there was a look that suggested he wanted to say something. He started to open his mouth, then closed it again. After repeating this several times, Ethan shook his head slightly and said he was fine. Allison convinced herself it was adolescence. Children change as they grow. It's natural. But somewhere in her heart, a small doubt remained. Oliver was growing bigger day by day. Past 3 months old, his weight had increased, and holding him was gradually becoming more difficult. Especially during bath time, she had to be careful not to let him slip while supporting him with one hand and washing with the other. Allison's arms were tired. One evening when Patricia visited, Allison mentioned this fatigue. Bath time was getting harder. Patricia immediately offered to help. Her voice was kind, and her genuine desire to help came through. Allison was grateful. There was no reason to refuse her mother-in-law's kindness. Patricia was a former teacher who had worked with children for many years. Allison thought she must be used to handling babies. Her mother-in-law nodded with a smile, saying to leave it to her. Ethan, who had been listening to this conversation in the living room, started to stand up from the sofa. But then, as if trying to say something, he sat back down. His expression was clearly anxious. His brow was furrowed and he was biting his lip. Allison noticed Ethan's behavior but didn't think deeply about it. Her son probably had complicated feelings about his grandmother. She interpreted it as emotional fluctuations typical of adolescence. Ethan said nothing. He just stared at the crib where Oliver was sleeping. In his eyes dwelt something that couldn't be put into words. Worry, anxiety, and a sense of helplessness. but the 7-year-old boy still hadn't found the words to properly express those feelings. Patricia headed to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Allison picked up Oliver and nursed him. Ethan sat quietly watching television, but his gaze occasionally turned toward his grandmother. Dusk approached and the living room lights were turned on. Outside, the autumn wind swayed the trees, and colored leaves danced down. Inside the house looked warm and peaceful. But beneath that peace, a small crack that no one noticed was quietly beginning to spread. Ethan stood up and said he was going to his room. Allison nodded, saying she would call him when dinner was ready. As Ethan climbed the stairs, he turned back just once more to look at his baby brother. Then, with an expression as if he had resolved something, he closed his bedroom door. One evening, Patricia arrived earlier than usual. Around 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang, and when Allison opened the door, her mother-in-law stood there holding large shopping bags in both hands. "Today is Oliver's bath day, isn't it?" Patricia said brightly. She offered to give him his bath. Allison hesitated for a moment. But that day she was especially tired. Oliver hadn't slept well the night before, and Allison was also sleep-deprived. David had contacted her saying he would be late tonight too. Her mother-in-law's offer was like a lifeline. Allison asked if she was really sure. Patricia smiled gently. "Of course, you rest a little," she said. In those words was the warmth of a grandmother who truly loved her grandchild. Allison expressed her gratitude. Her mother-in-law picked Oliver up from his crib. The baby was in good spirits and smiled slightly. Patricia spoke to the baby as she headed toward the bathroom, saying in a gentle voice that they would take a bath together with Grandma. Allison sat on the sofa, thinking she could finally catch her breath. Ethan was doing homework in the corner of the living room. It was a quiet evening. However, that silence was suddenly broken. Ethan suddenly stood up. So forcefully that his chair nearly toppled over. His face had gone pale. "Mom," Ethan shouted. There was urgency in his voice. Allison turned around in surprise and asked what was wrong. Ethan rushed to Allison with a desperate expression. "Don't let Grandma take care of the baby," he cried out. His voice was trembling. Allison was confused. "Why?" she asked back. She could tell that something was seriously wrong from Ethan's behavior, but she had no idea what the reason was. Ethan grabbed his mother's arm. "You can't, please," he pleaded. Tears welled up in his eyes. It was rare for a 7-year-old boy to be this desperate. Allison knelt down to meet her son's eye level. "Ethan, what are you talking about? Calm down," she said gently. But Ethan wouldn't calm down. "Just go look," Ethan said. "Then you'll understand, please, Mom." His voice was pleading. Allison stood up. She had never seen her son like this. She thought maybe something really serious was happening. But at the same time, she also thought there was no way her mother-in-law would do anything bad to the baby. Still, pushed by Ethan's desperation, Allison headed toward the bathroom. As she walked down the hallway, she felt her heartbeat quicken. Ethan followed behind her. The bathroom door was half closed. Allison put her hand on the doorknob and gently opened the door just a little. She peered inside. At that moment, Allison gasped. Patricia was sitting on the edge of the bathtub. She was holding Oliver with one hand, unstably. The baby's body was tilted at an angle and looked like it might slip at any moment. Her mother-in-law's other hand was reaching for the faucet. Water was rushing out forcefully. But Patricia wasn't checking the water temperature. Without putting her hand in the water, she was just pouring water into the tub. Water had already begun to accumulate in the bathtub, and steam was rising from that water. It was hot water. Oliver was crying. Crying loudly. And Patricia was yelling at the baby. "Be quiet," her voice was sharp and full of irritation. It wasn't the usual gentle voice of her mother-in-law. Words floated into Allison's mind. Was this abuse? What was her mother-in-law trying to do to the baby? Allison hurriedly opened the bathroom door. "Mother-in-law," she shouted loudly. Patricia turned around in surprise. Confusion showed on her face. "What?" she said. Her face looked as if she didn't understand what she had been doing. Allison snatched the baby away from her mother-in-law. Oliver was crying intensely, but there didn't appear to be any injuries on his body. Allison held the baby tightly. Patricia looked at Allison blankly. "Did I do something?" she murmured. There was confusion in her voice. Allison's hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding violently. Her mind went completely blank. She couldn't understand what was happening. But one thing was certain, the baby had been in a dangerous situation. Allison took out her smartphone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking and she couldn't touch the screen properly. After several attempts, she finally pressed the emergency number. "Hello, is this 911?" Allison said. Her voice was trembling. "My mother-in-law and the baby," she tried to continue, but the words wouldn't come. The operator's calm voice could be heard. "Please calm down, what happened?" Allison took a deep breath and tried to explain. "In the bath, dangerous situation, the baby," incoherent words came out of her mouth. Ethan stood at the entrance to the bathroom, watching the scene quietly. On his face was a mixture of sadness and somehow relief. Relief that Mom had finally noticed. But at the same time, sadness that Grandma would be blamed. Patricia was still sitting there blankly. "What was I doing?" she murmured quietly. In her eyes was real confusion. It was as if she had no memory of what had just happened. As Allison continued the phone call, she felt tears running down her cheeks. Holding Oliver tightly, she looked at her mother-in-law again. On Patricia's face was fear and bewilderment. She didn't seem to understand what was happening herself. The ambulance and police arrived just 5 minutes after the call. Red and blue lights flashed in the quiet residential neighborhood, and neighbors were watching from their windows. 2 police officers entered through the front door. An older male officer and a young female officer. The male officer spoke gently to Allison, asking her to tell them what happened. Allison tried to explain through tears. "My mother-in-law, the baby, in the bath," the words wouldn't connect properly. Oliver was still crying, his body trembling in Allison's arms. The paramedic asked to examine the baby. Allison hesitated but eventually handed Oliver over. The paramedic gently held the baby and quickly checked him all over. He took his temperature, listened to his heart, and checked for any wounds or bruises on his body. A few minutes later, the paramedic looked relieved. "The baby is fine, there are no injuries," he announced. "He seems to just be crying from being startled." Allison breathed a deep sigh of relief. But the confusion still continued. The young female officer went to check the bathroom. Hot water was still flowing from the faucet, and she quickly turned it off. She spoke to Patricia, who was sitting slumped on the edge of the tub. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the female officer asked. Patricia slowly raised her face. Her eyes seemed unfocused. "Who?" she said quietly. The female officer introduced herself, saying she was with the police. She asked gently if Patricia could tell her what had happened. Patricia looked around with a confused expression. "Bath," she murmured. But the words after that wouldn't come. It was as if she couldn't remember what she had been doing. The female officer returned to the living room and whispered something to the older male officer. The male officer nodded and called the paramedic. One of the paramedics turned toward Allison. "This might not be abuse," he said. Allison asked in surprise. "What?" "But that situation." The paramedic chose his words carefully. "Your mother-in-law may have a medical problem," he said. "It could be cognitive decline or some kind of neurological issue. She needs to see a specialist." In Allison's mind, several pieces began to connect. Her mother-in-law's recent behavior. How she sometimes seemed out of it. How she sometimes stumbled over words in the middle of conversations. But she had thought all of that was just due to age. The male officer came over to Ethan. He knelt down gently to meet the boy's eye level. "You were very brave," he said. "Can you tell me why you said, 'Don't let Grandma take care of him'?" Ethan looked at his mother. Allison nodded, saying it was okay to talk. Ethan began speaking in a small voice. "Before, when Grandma gave me a bath," he said. "When was that?" Allison asked. Ethan answered, "About 2 months ago. When Mom was sick and sleeping." Allison remembered that day. There certainly was a day when she had a terrible headache and had been sleeping all afternoon. Patricia had come over and looked after Ethan. She had even given him a bath. Allison had been grateful. Ethan continued. "The water was really hot. I tried to endure it, but it was really hot. I told Grandma. I said, 'Grandma, it's hot.' But Grandma didn't seem to understand." The officer gently prompted him to continue. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. "And also, Grandma took the soap and brought it close to my mouth. She said, 'Eat this.' I was surprised and said, 'Grandma, that's not food.'" Allison gasped. Ethan continued through tears. "But Grandma kept saying, 'Eat it,' over and over. I was scared. Finally I said, 'I'm too full to eat,' and Grandma finally stopped." The female officer asked why he hadn't told his mother about this. Ethan answered that he had tried to tell her. But Dad had said, "Grandma is fine." So he thought maybe he had misunderstood. Since Grandma was a kind person, maybe he had made some mistake. "But," he continued, "after the baby was born, when Grandma said she would take care of Oliver, he was scared. What if Grandma tried to make him eat soap again? What if the water was too hot? The baby couldn't endure it like he had." Allison hugged Ethan. "Thank you, Ethan, thank you," she said over and over. "You protected your brother." Ethan cried against his mother's chest. The paramedics began preparing to transport Patricia to the hospital. She remained confused, not seeming to understand what was happening. Allison rushed to her mother-in-law. "Mother-in-law, it's all right," she said. "Let's go to the hospital." Patricia looked at Allison. Fear was in her eyes. "Did I do something?" she asked. "Did I hurt my grandchild?" Allison answered gently. "No, no one is hurt. Let's just get you checked out." When she called David, he said he would head home right away. Distress was evident in his voice. Several hours later, the hospital called. Allison and David took the call together. The doctor's voice was calm but serious. "Your mother has early-stage Alzheimer's disease," the doctor announced. David said with an expression of disbelief that his mother could carry on normal conversations though. The doctor explained that in the early stages, social conversational abilities are often relatively preserved. However, judgment, danger recognition abilities, and the ability to understand the purpose of objects decline. People may not be able to tell water temperature or distinguish between soap and food. Allison asked if there was any treatment. The doctor answered that while there's no cure, drug therapy can slow the progression. Also, day care and rehabilitation can be effective. Most important is family support. After hanging up, Allison and David sat in silence. David held his head in his hands. "My mother," he murmured. "I didn't notice." Allison placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. "No one noticed. But Ethan protected us." The two looked at the room where their children were sleeping. Ethan was sleeping next to Oliver's crib, as if protecting his brother. 1 week after Patricia was discharged from the hospital, the entire Harrison family gathered in the living room. David had left work early to come home. This discussion was unavoidable. David let out a deep sigh. "Maybe we should put Mom in a facility," he said. Anguish was evident in his voice. Allison held her husband's hand. "But your mother is family," she said. "We have to support her." Ethan said in a small voice that Grandma wasn't a bad person, right? Allison gently stroked her son's head. "No, she's not a bad person. She's sick. Grandma still loves us just like before. It's just that part of her brain isn't working properly." The family had repeated discussions. They decided not to isolate Patricia, but to support her. But at the same time, they confirmed that the children's safety was the top priority. When Patricia visited, someone would always be with her. They would never let her care for the children alone. Patricia began treatment for dementia. 3 times a week, she went to a specialized day care center and also received drug therapy. According to the doctor, while the disease's progression couldn't be completely stopped, it could be slowed with proper care. One afternoon, after returning from day care, Patricia visited Allison's house. It wasn't like her previous frequent visits. Now it was just once a week at a set time. Patricia sat on the living room sofa and shed tears. "I put my grandchildren in danger, didn't I?" she said. Deep regret was in her voice. Allison sat next to her mother-in-law. "It's not your fault, it's the disease," she said gently. "What's important is that we're together now." Patricia raised her face and looked at Allison. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not abandoning me like this." A year passed. The Harrison family had built a new rhythm of life. Patricia's visits were once a week, only when David or Allison was definitely there with her. She treasured the time spent with her grandchildren, and the family welcomed her warmly. Ethan had become even kinder toward Patricia than before. One Saturday afternoon, he called out to his grandmother, asking if she wanted to do a puzzle together. Patricia smiled happily. "Thank you, Ethan." The two sat side by side assembling the puzzle. Sometimes Patricia couldn't figure out where to place a piece, but Ethan patiently helped her. Oliver had passed his first birthday and was beginning to toddle around. Patricia rejoiced in her grandson's growth but never tried to care for him alone. She understood her limitations. One evening, Allison had a conversation with Ethan alone. "You protected your brother," she said. "Thank you so much." Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I wanted to protect Grandma too." Allison asked in surprise what he meant. Ethan said with a serious face that he didn't want Grandma to become a bad guy. Because Grandma is a kind person. He wanted everyone to understand that she was sick. Allison shed tears. "You're such a kind child." Ethan smiled. "Because we're family. Family helps each other, right?" Hearing those words, Allison hugged her son. Then she looked out the window. The sun was setting. Orange light illuminated the living room. What is family? It's not about being perfect. It's supporting each other, especially in difficult times, not abandoning anyone. Accepting illness, weakness, everything, while walking forward together. Ethan's small courage taught this family something important: to listen to children's voices, to notice changes in loved ones, and above all, the true meaning of protecting the entire family. A new day for the Harrison family was about to quietly begin.